20,000 years ago, someone knelt in the dark and carved a body out of stone. Not a hunter, not a warrior. A woman, wide-hipped, faceless, swollen with life. She had no name that survived. But for longer than any religion alive today has existed, she was the center of everything. Who was she? Long before Zeus, long before Yahweh, long before Odin raised his spear over Asgard, there was her. Archaeologists call her the Venus figurine, a cold, clinical name for something that once held the weight of human survival in its hands. She appears from the Pyrenees to Siberia, carved from mammoth ivory, limestone, clay. Different hands, different centuries, the same body. Wide hips, full belly, no face. Why no face? Because she wasn't a portrait. She was a function. A face makes a figure into a person. No face keeps her as a force, something closer to weather than to a woman down the street. That is the first clue to who she really was. For over 20,000 years, across the last ice age and into the first farms, versions of her appear again and again in the archaeological record. Compare that span to Christianity's roughly 2,000 years, or Islam's 1,400. This figure outlasts them by a margin so large it barely feels real. And yet, almost nobody outside academic circles has heard her name. Archaeologist Marija Gimbutas spent decades studying Neolithic Europe and proposed something radical. She argued that early agricultural societies were organized around the worship of a great goddess, a life-giving, death-dealing force tied to the earth itself. Her theory, known as the Old European Civilization Hypothesis, suggested that before sky gods and thunder gods took over, the divine was imagined as female, as fertile, as the ground you stood on. Not everyone agrees with her conclusions. Some scholars think Gimbutas overreached, reading a single unified religion into objects that may have served very different purposes across very different cultures. But even her critics admit something strange is happening in that archaeological record. The images keep repeating. The body keeps returning. Something was being worshipped or feared or both. Here is the psychological reality underneath the debate. Early human survival did not depend on conquering enemies or building empires. It depended on two things above all else: food that kept growing back, and children who kept being born. Both of those miracles seemed to come from the same source: a body that could produce life without any visible effort, again and again, season after season. To a hunter-gatherer watching the world die every winter and return every spring, the female body was not just biology. It was proof that death was not the end of the story. Fertility was not a private matter. It was cosmology. So they carved her, not to flatter her, to summon what she represented: continuation, renewal, the refusal of the world to simply end. Then something changed. Around 10 to 12,000 years ago, agriculture spread, populations grew, and with them came surplus, hierarchy, and eventually, war. And the gods began to change with the times. Religious historian Mircea Eliade described this shift as part of a much larger pattern he called the transition from earth-based to sky-based religion. As settled societies grew more organized and more violent, their gods increasingly took the form of warriors, kings, and thunderers, figures who ruled from above rather than grew from below. Zeus, Marduk, Indra, Yahweh in his early storm god form, sky fathers replacing earth mothers, one culture at a time. Why does that shift matter to you, watching this now thousands of years later? Because the same psychological pattern is still running underneath modern life. When people feel safe, abundant, and connected to nature, their symbols of ultimate power tend to be nurturing, cyclical, feminine. When people feel threatened, scarce, and in competition with other groups, their symbols of ultimate power shift toward domination, hierarchy, and control. Watch which one shows up more in your own feed today. At the site of Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, one of the earliest large settlements ever discovered, archaeologist James Millart uncovered dozens of figurines resembling that same full-bodied faceless woman, often found seated on what looked like a throne flanked by leopards. 9,000 years old, a goddess enthroned, guarded, powerful, long before any written language existed to record her name. We don't know what her worshippers called her. We don't know if she was one goddess or many, a single cult or shared instinct that kept independently reappearing across cultures that never met. That uncertainty is not a failure of archaeology. It is the point. She predates language itself. She predates the concept of a single correct religion. She is what belief looked like before belief had rules. Consider what that means. Every major religion you can name today, every scripture, every prophet, every sacred text arrived after her. She is not a footnote in religious history. She may be its root system, buried so deep that the traditions growing from it forgot where their roots came from. And here is the twist that makes this more than ancient trivia. She never actually left. Trace the lineage forward, and the fingerprints are everywhere. Isis, wept over by mourners in Egypt long before Christianity existed, worshipped with maternal, life-giving imagery that later Christian iconography would echo. Demeter, whose grief over her lost daughter Persephone was said to cause winter itself, fertility and death, bound in the same story. And the Virgin Mary elevated over centuries into a figure of maternal universal compassion, standing in churches built, in some cases, on the exact same ground where earlier goddess temples once stood. Historian Ronald Hutton, who has studied the survival and reinvention of pre-Christian religious imagery across Europe, has documented how persistently these older maternal and earth-based symbols resurface inside newer religious frameworks, absorbed rather than erased. The names changed, the theology changed, the underlying psychological need, something to embody birth, death, and renewal in a single image, never went away. Think about what you still do without noticing it. You call disasters Mother Nature's fury. You describe the planet as something to be nurtured, protected, healed, using language borrowed directly from birth and motherhood. You still instinctively personify the earth as female when you want to explain why it deserves reverence rather than exploitation. That is not a coincidence. That is 20,000 years of pattern still running quietly in the background of modern language. So why does this forgotten figure matter to you personally right now? Because the questions she was built to answer have not gone away. Where does life come from? Why does it end? Will anything continue after we're gone? You may not carve her image into stone anymore, but scroll through what people worship today, what they idolize, what they build entire identities and communities around, and you will still find the same underlying hunger. Something to explain continuation, something to make death feel survivable. The oldest god humanity worshipped may not have had a name we remember, or a single face at all, but she may be the reason every later god, every scripture, every sacred story that followed her ever felt necessary in the first place. Look closer at how she was carved, and another detail stands out. Her hands are often small, almost an afterthought. Her feet in many figurines taper off entirely, as though she was never meant to stand and walk among people. She was meant to be held, or placed, or buried with the dead. Her body was the message. Nothing else needed to move. Compare that to almost every god who came after her. Zeus needed a thunderbolt in his fist. Marduk needed a weapon to slay chaos itself. Even Yahweh, in his earliest storm god descriptions, needed a voice that could shake mountains. Power, in the world that followed her, became something you demonstrated through action. Her power required no action at all. She simply was. That distinction is easy to miss and impossible to overstate. There's a reason this matters for how you understand religion generally, not just prehistory. Every belief system answers a version of the same three questions. Where did we come from? Why do we suffer? What happens when we die? The earliest answer humans seem to have settled on, repeated in stone across a continent for millennia, was disturbingly simple. We come from a body. We suffer because that body sometimes withholds what we need. And when we die, we return to the same source that produced us in the first place, the way seed returns to soil. That is not a metaphor for people carving these figures. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer cosmologies have repeatedly found that many pre-agricultural societies did not draw a hard boundary between the living, the dead, and the land itself. Burial practices from a period often placed the dead in curled, fetal positions, sometimes stained with red ochre to mimic blood, as if death itself were being staged as a second birth. Historian and archaeologist Timothy Taylor has written extensively about how Paleolithic burial customs encoded exactly this belief, that dying was not an ending, but a return trip back into whatever force had produced life the first time. Ask yourself honestly whether that idea has actually disappeared. Reincarnation, resurrection, rebirth, the return of the soul to some greater source, these ideas show up independently across nearly every major religious tradition that followed, from Hindu and Buddhist cycles of rebirth to Christian resurrection theology, to the Norse belief that the dead return to feed new life in the soil of Yggdrasil's roots. The specific mythology changes completely from culture to culture. The underlying shape of the idea barely changes at all. Why would completely unconnected civilizations, separated by oceans and thousands of years, keep independently arriving at the same basic answer? One possibility is unsettling in its simplicity. Maybe it is an independent invention at all. Maybe it's memory. Not literal memory passed down through generations, but a kind of psychological residue, an idea so early and so useful for surviving the terror of mortality that it became baked into how human minds process death itself, regardless of which culture eventually built a religion around it. That brings us back to her, the faceless figure with no name. If Gimbutas and Eliade are right, even partially, then what we're looking at in these figurines isn't simply an ancient fertility charm. It's the prototype. The first attempt at solving the oldest problem humans have ever faced, and every subsequent religion, no matter how different its gods look, may still be running variations on that same original solution. Consider what happened once agriculture took hold and cities began to rise. Surplus food meant some people could stop farming and start specializing as priests, soldiers, rulers. Populations that had once cooperated out of necessity now competed over land, water, and stored grain. Violence between groups increased, and gods, historians have observed, tend to mirror the anxieties of the people who worship them. A society terrified of drought and starvation invents a controlling storm. God who must be appeased. A society organizing itself into kings and hierarchies invents divine kings and heavenly thrones to justify that same hierarchy on earth. The old goddess didn't vanish overnight. She was absorbed, split, and reassigned. Some of her power went to harvest goddesses, tied specifically to grain and agriculture rather than the whole of existence. Some of it went to goddesses of love and desire, a narrower, more domesticated version of what had once represented all of life and death combined. And in many traditions, what remained of her authority over life and death itself was slowly transferred to increasingly male, increasingly militarized sky gods who ruled from thrones in the heavens rather than from the dark, buried earth she had once represented. This is why, if you visit certain ancient temple sites across the Mediterranean and the Near East, you can sometimes find newer structures built directly on top of far older ones. A church built over a Roman temple, built over an even earlier shrines to a local mother goddess. Archaeologists refer to this layering as continuity of sacred space, the tendency for a location once considered holy to remain holy indefinitely. Even as the specific god being worshipped, there changes entirely across centuries. That pattern isn't just architectural convenience. It suggests something almost involuntary about human religious behavior. We don't invent sacredness randomly. We inherit it generation after generation, often without knowing where it originally came from, simply because a place or a shape or a symbol has always felt important long after anyone remembers exactly why. So when you picture the Virgin Mary cradling an infant in countless paintings across 1,000 years of Christian art, you are looking at an image with unmistakable visual roots stretching back through Isis nursing Horus, through Demeter mourning and restoring her daughter, through figures older still, all the way back to a faceless woman, carved from mammoth ivory by someone whose name, language, and even country no longer exist in any record. The theology changed completely. The image and the emotional need behind it did not. Think about your own life for a moment. You don't have to believe in any god at all to feel the pull of these same patterns. You mark birthdays as small rituals of continuation. You plant gardens, sometimes for no practical reason, beyond watching something grow. You describe grief as a season, something you move through rather than something that simply ends you. Every one of those instincts echoes the same worldview that produced her 20,000 years ago. Life as cycle, not as straight line, decline followed by return rather than simple ending. That is the real reason her story deserves more attention than it gets. Not because she proves any single religion right or wrong, but because she reveals something underneath all of them. Long before scripture, long before prophets, long before anyone wrote down a single commandment, humans were already asking the same questions you still ask today. Quietly, in the dark, without any guarantee of an answer. 20,000 years ago, someone knelt in the dark and carved a body out of stone, not to remember a person, but to hold onto a promise that the world would keep coming back. That promise, it turns out, never actually needed a name, a scripture, or a single believer left alive to keep surviving. It just needed someone, anyone, willing to keep asking the question in the dark.